So you want to know more about Juanita Brooks, a titan in the field of Mormon history, who authored one of the most consequential books about Mormonism's past. Today I'd like to introduce you, or give a bit more background, to one of my personal heroes, Juanita Brooks, a historian who should be seen as the founder, or one of the founders, of the academic study of Mormonism. So if you enjoy books that investigate Mormonism's past with academic rigor and neutral analysis, you have people like Juanita Brooks to thank. She also has a fascinating story in her own right, growing up as a woman in a patriarchal tradition, trying to carve out her space, with one anecdote probably capturing best this awkward dynamic. It's a story she would tell often, that while she was writing, there would always be a pile of clothes on the sewing table nearby, quote, with a threaded needle stuck to it so that I can shift to that whenever I'm interrupted, whenever she had guests. But as soon as those guests would leave, she would return to the typewriter without taking another stitch, showing this awkward fit within a broader culture that did not expect women to be authors. Her book on the Mountain Meadows Massacre transformed both the academic field of Mormon history, but also caused a reckoning for the community. So today's video is part of my every Friday series on So You Want to Know more about X, in which I peel back the curtain on the historical profession, talking about some of the most important books, historiographical evolutions, or even particular topics of primary sources and digging in. So if you want to know more about just the Mountain Meadows Massacre, to which Juanita Brooks contributed, you can go watch my previous video on that subject. Today, I want to talk specifically about Brooks, her life, her scholarship, her legacies, and why she is someone worth learning about. Born Juanita Leavitt in Bunkerville, Nevada in 1898, Juanita was raised surrounded by rich cultural and familial history. Her grandfather, Dudley Leavitt, was a leading figure in the community, one of the first founders and colonizers of the region. And so she grew up hearing about these stories and legends about how the community came to be. And that prompted an investigatory spirit within her to learn about those stories and the real background. She eventually became a teacher, soon married a man named Ernest Pulsifer, who then died about a year after their marriage, leaving her a young widow with a young child. She was only 22. Here's a picture of her a little later with her and her son. She would go on to receive a degree from Brigham Young University and becoming an instructor of English at Dixie Community College, what would later become Dixie State and now Utah Tech University. At one point, she took a sabbatical from teaching to go to New York City so that she could receive a master's degree from Columbia University. And then in the 1930s, she married a St. George widower, Will Brooks, becoming Juanita Brooks, and then blending what came to be a rather large family with her child, Will's 4 sons, and then together they had 4 more children. Now, her life could have stayed there, ensconced in the gendered expectations for someone at their time, maybe teaching a little bit on the side, but mostly being a dutiful wife and mother, as well as just being a devout Latter-day Saints. But she always had a drive and questions that pushed her, prompted her to do more. And I want to share one anecdote that probably drove that spirit. When she was a young teacher, she was assigned to teach in Mesquite, Nevada. And in that congregation was an old, grizzled Latter-day Saint pioneer by the name of Nephi Johnson, who approached her once at her school room and told her that he wanted to sit down with her and reveal things that he had never told anyone before. She saw in her someone who appreciated history and community and reckonings. Now, unfortunately, she never actually did that sit-down talk with him, and he would die shortly afterwards, actually complaining on his deathbed, "Bring me the school teacher so I could tell her the story." That never happened. Turns out, Nephi Johnson was one of the Mormons at the Mountain Meadows Massacre and wanted to tell her those details. Because she never got to hear it from him, she devoted herself to eventually coming back and learning that whole story. By the way, if you enjoy this type of nerdy analysis and peeling back the curtain on history, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. As I mentioned, every Friday, I talk about historians, historical topics, historiography. Mondays, I do deep dives on a particular issue. On Wednesdays, I try to connect the past to the present, showing why history is still relevant. So subscribe to the channel if you're interested, like and share the video so we can broaden the discussion. And if you want a way to give back, you can become a member of the channel, which comes with a number of perks. All right, let's get back to Juanita. Juanita got her chance to become more of a historian during the Great Depression. That might seem ironic. How during an era of economic downturn could someone like Juanita Brooks strengthen her historical chops? Well, part of the New Deal legislation passed by Franklin Roosevelt and the federal government hired lots of people into government jobs, including jobs that related to history and the arts and the humanities. So part of the Works Progress Administration, she was hired to find, transcribe, and archive pioneer diaries, a task through which she became friends with other historians like Dale Morgan, someone also hired as part of these New Deal initiatives. Juanita was soon collaborating with the Utah Historical Society as well as the Huntington Library, and she was quickly becoming one of the foremost experts, knowing both pioneer diaries, published sources, and archival records, so she wasn't getting all the access that she wanted from the LDS Church. Now, she produced a number of important articles and works on family history, but she wanted to return to that topic that Nephi Johnson had pointed her to before, the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And this is the reason why she told Dale Morgan in the 1940s, saying, quote, "My reason is that Mountain Meadows Massacre is listed as one of the topics in Western history which was considered as a subject for further research." So someone had told her about it. "I felt that as a member of the church, I could perhaps present it with more understanding than could a person without an LDS background. In delving into the subject, I did the best I could to present my findings fully and honestly. I could do nothing else." Close quote. That was her explanation for wanting to write a history that fit the standards and rigor of academia, but came from a place within the community, again, hoping to cause a reckoning. This grew out, by the way, of her writing her own autobiography and a sense of trying to reconcile herself and her community with this past. And she knew an accurate history of the Mountain Meadows was going to cause problems with the community. It was going to force them to confront difficult issues. But without that narrative, she believed that community, that faith, could not move on. So she gathered as many records as she could. She mastered the sources that were at her disposal, although, again, she wasn't able to get all the records in Salt Lake City she wanted. In fact, she feared that after Heber J. Grant died in the 1940s, Joseph Fielding Smith, who was the church historian at the time, would restrict even further access. But eventually she got to the point where she could compile all her work into a book. That book finally appeared in 1950 as the Mountain Meadows Massacre. It was published by Stanford University Press, but not without some trepidation from the press, worried, is this going to be an apologetic narrative? And so at one point, the Stanford University Press editor wrote Juanita, kind of trying to tease out, what is your goal here? And this is how she responded to him, quote, "I do not want to be excommunicated from my church for many reasons, but if that is the price I must pay for intellectual honesty, I shall pay it. I hope without bitterness. Is that the statement you wanted?" Close quote. You could see that she knew the risk of publishing this book, but she wanted to make it clear it was an independent, scholarly, rigorous analysis, not a hagiographic narrative. And indeed, the Mountain Meadows Massacre was an unflinching story of a community that committed atrocity. Now, up until that point, the LDS Church's official narrative, and the narrative that was adopted by Utah education, was that the massacre was perpetrated by Paiute Indians, not the white Mormons. And instead, the real historical record, which many had been suspecting for a while, but now definitively shown in Juanita Brooks's book, was that it was a massacre orchestrated, led, and then covered up by white Mormons. Now, of course, she addressed the question of, was Brigham Young complicit? She did not find any evidence, nor have many historians since then, that Brigham Young had ordered the massacre, but she did say that Brigham Young was guilty of creating an environment that made the Mountain Meadows Massacre possible, if not predictable. She said that his sermons put them in a state of despair and radicalism. And further, she then called Brigham Young an accessory after the fact for obstructing investigation. So in other words, she did not indict Brigham Young for orchestrating the massacre, but she did say that he had some blood on his hands. She also even reckoned with her own ancestors' involvement, saying that he might have been one of the many who got swept up. That's what I mean by a cultural reckoning. She also takes an interesting stance on John D. Lee, claiming that he was one of the leaders, but he ends up being a scapegoat for being the only person who is punished, although Isaac Haight is also indicted. But John D. Lee is the only person who is executed for the crime, despite the broader community involvement. She actually had an interesting relationship with John D. Lee's family. The Lee family actually provided the $3,000 advance to the press to make sure that the book would make money. Maybe a topic that deserves a bit more investigation. It would be hard to overstate the impact of that book, both on the community, on the church, and academia. But that did not mean that there were explicit reactions, especially from the LDS institution. In fact, rather than denouncing it and then excommunicating her like they did with Fawn Brodie 5 years earlier, they took the approach of silence. This is how Juanita Brooks put it when someone asked her about the church's reaction to the book. Quote, "You asked how it has been received. Well, by silence. Total and absolute. Not a word anywhere. My local people, the bishop and the president of the stake, and all the authorities have never referred to the book. They evade it with the delicacy and solicitude they might show to a mother who has given birth to a monster child. No one among the higher-ups will admit that he has read it. As near as I can tell, few have. At any rate, no official action has been taken, which must mean that I have a few friends in this camp." I find that reaction quite instructive of how the church had evolved. Now, they were reading it. We have plenty of evidence that they were reading it, and sometimes they want to take a reaction or take a step, but they realized, especially after in the wake of the Fawn Brodie excommunication, that they would get bad press for that. There were some people who tried to push back on Fawn Brodie for being too harsh on people like Brigham Young, and this is how Fawn Brodie responded to one of them. Quote, "I love and honor our leaders, not because they are perfect, but because they are human. This includes Brigham Young, who could not help being affected by the things which had happened to him in Missouri and Nauvoo, and which later developed in Utah." In other words, she is trying to place Brigham Young in historical context while still being sympathetic to their environment. I will note that the LDS Church did stamp out an attempt to make a movie based on the book. Hollywood had optioned it for a film, and the LDS Church used a number of leaders, we've learned through the David O. McKay diaries, to make sure that never happened. So there was a response. It just took place behind doors. It's also worthwhile to discuss Juanita Brooks's relationship to the church. The church wasn't always thrilled with the scholarship she was doing, but she felt devoted to the community, even when she faced backlash from many in the community who felt that she was pushing a revisionist or critical take. So I want to introduce you to 4 of some of my favorite quotes about Juanita Brooks that demonstrate her relationship to the faith and what she was trying to do. She would often use the metaphor of the herd, that she was helping herd the church community in a certain direction. This is what she says, quote, "I act on the theory that the best way to turn a herd of cattle is not to ride directly counter to them, but to travel with them and turn them gradually. I draw my figure from my own early experience." This is another point where she explained that she knew she did not fully fit in and was not representative of heterodox Mormons, but she wanted to claim her place within the faith. Quote, "I retain my fellowship in the church because I like it and I need it and I want my children to have its benefits, but I refuse to surrender my intellectual independence to it." Or here's another quote, "I am in fact in a state of apostasy, perhaps, with many of the practices and teachings of our church. I simply cannot accept them and retain my intellectual independence, which I do try to maintain. And yet I am loyal to it. I think it as much my church as it is J. Reuben Clark's or anyone else." She also would often push back on other Mormon scholars who she felt was becoming more apologetic. This is what she wrote to Hugh Nibley after reading Hugh Nibley's No Ma'am, That's Not History pamphlet, which was an expose of Fawn Brodie's No Man Knows My History. She told him, quote, "I may be wrong, often I am, but it seems to me that in our zeal to answer Mrs. Brodie, we make some statements almost as far-fetched as hers." That's an indictment that is probably true for a lot of apologetics. And we can't also overstate how significant she was, not just for scholars and academics doing a true historical reckoning, but also for women. The story of keeping an ironing board or a patch of clothes to knit nearby. Laurel Ulrich, one of the greatest historians Mormonism and America ever produced, once said that she used Juanita Brooks' example of how, quote, ironing women could be thinkers too, laying a groundwork for many scholars to come later to also challenge those gender norms. It would be hard to overstate the impact that Juanita Brooks had on the Mormon community, both the scholarship and the faithful. She tried to push back against the retrenchment she saw going on with the faith, once denouncing what she called the Reubenization of Mormon education, which was J. Reuben Clark's impact. She also tried to embody and exemplify to many others that you could be a Latter-day Saints and write an honest history. John Krakauer, author of the best-selling book Under the Banner of Heaven, once said that every book in Mormon history is a reaction to Juanita Brooks, which I think is very much true. And thankfully, the scholarly world has come to recognize this and highlight Juanita Brooks' contributions. For a number of years, Joey Stewart and Christina Rossetti ran the Juanita Brooks Conference for Utah and Mormon History. I was privileged to participate a couple times. They have an edited volume on that coming out. St. George now has a statue to her in their Founders Park in the city center of the city. The Brooks family have established a Juanita Brooks Historical Preservation Society, and they are trying to create a museum in her honor in St. George. There really needs to be a Juanita Brooks Endowed Chair of Mormon or Western History at Utah Tech University. So if you have a few $1 million hanging around that's burning a hole in your wallet, please donate to that. Now, where can you learn more about Juanita Brooks? Well, first, I think it's always good to read her classic work of scholarship. Read her The Mountain Meadows Massacre, first published by Stanford University Press, but has since been republished several times in different formats. You can also read her moving and powerful autobiography, Quicksand and Cactus. You can read a biography of her by the great Mormon author Levi Peterson. You can read the interview that she did with Dialogue titled Writing Heard. And you can also read her collection of letters published a few years ago by the University of Utah Press, edited by Craig Smith, titled The Selected Letters of Juanita Brooks. I'll have links to all of those in the description. Juanita Brooks is a hero for anyone who wants an academic, unbiased perspective on history. She is someone who it's rewarding to go and learn and read and interrogate and wrestle with. She exemplifies why history matters even today, because she shows that the reckonings that come through this struggle are worthwhile, even if they're still difficult. I hope you enjoyed this video useful. If so, please like it and share it with others. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet. Consider being a member. History, as Juanita Brooks demonstrated, has never been more relevant than it is today, which is why these discussions are so important.